Hi, and welcome back to Undisclosed. I'm attorney, author, and advocate Rabia Chaudhry, and I'm here with my colleague, Colin Miller.
Hi, this is Colin Miller. I'm a professor of law at the University of South Carolina School of Law, and I blog at Evidence Prof blog.
Did that music just trigger something in you? Does it sound familiar? If you're a true crime connoisseur, you must surely recognize it as the theme to the Netflix series Mindhunter. And if you haven't seen it, I have to question your life choices. Nonetheless, the central protagonists in the series are the figures of FBI agents Bill Tench and Holden Ford, both of whom are characters based on real-life FBI agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas.
If those names sound familiar to you, it's because you may have some knowledge about the infamous FBI Behavioral Science Unit. That's the department the agency established back in 1972 that eventually developed the methodology behind profiling serial killers, which is what the TV show is all about. While it's a great series and these characters are compelling, there was a third character that likely also caught your attention.
Well, I'm glad this worked out. You know, when you sent me your notes from the Kemper meetings, I was in a real rut with my new book.
What's your book about?
It's about white-collar criminals, men not so different to your Edmund Kemper.
How do you think the men you study are similar to Edmund Kemper?
Well, first of all, they're all psychopaths. I study captains of industry. IBM, MGM, Ford, Exxon, you name it. And sure, these men all have wives, kids, dogs, goldfish, but not because they stopped being psychopaths, but because they just had different leanings.
That was the character of Dr. Wendy Carr. And just like the two male lead characters, Dr. Carr was also based on a real-life badass, the legendary Dr. Ann Burgess. The difference between the TV portrayal and the real-life version of events, however, is that Dr. Ann Burgess simply deserves a lot more credit than the series gave her credit for. A trained psychiatric nurse with a doctorate in nursing science, she was a trailblazer in examining the effects of sexual violence on victims all the way back in the 1960s. Her work didn't go unnoticed. The FBI caught wind of her studies and asked her to consult with them. That then led to Dr. Burgess analyzing hundreds of hours of interviews with known serial killers and single-handedly developing the psychological profile of this type of predator.
I first met Dr. Burgess in 2021 when I was introduced to what I can only describe as the coolest group of investigators ever. Dr. Burgess called her group the Super Sleuths, which is pretty adorable, and a founding member of the group is my dear friend and a good friend of this podcast, cold case homicide investigator Sarah Kalin. You might remember Sarah from her work with me on our Season 6 case, the Jason Carroll case out of New Hampshire. Sarah's path crossed with Dr. Burgess in the course of her academic work, and the two of them, along with a couple of others, launched a truly groundbreaking project during COVID. A virtual monthly meeting of a multidisciplinary group of experts in various areas of criminal justice and investigations, i.e. the Super Sleuths. The group includes current and former law enforcement, independent investigators, investigative journalists, forensic nurses, psychiatric experts, medical examiners, researchers, and academics, and yes, one single lawyer.
That came about, I was doing just a lecture to University of Maryland to a group of nurses, and we got talking afterwards about solving cases. And it just came up with, well, let's get a little group together and we'll go after some cold cases. And so it just kind of grew. I had other people that were interested in solving cases, and it's the way you learn, and it's the way to apply things. And I think I had learned that from the profiling.
Every month, this group is presented a cold case, sometimes by an outside investigator, sometimes by someone in the group. Back in 2021, I was fortuitously invited to present the case of the murder of Hae Min Lee, along with Adnan's attorney, Erica Suter. What came into sharp focus during that presentation and the discussion afterwards was one of the prime characters involved in the case, Alonzo Sellers. Fair warning, though, this is the part of the episode where you might want to pull out your murder board, spool of red thread, and a notebook. We are about to take you on quite a ride.
Let's go back before we get into the group's analysis of Alonzo Sellers and refresh your recollection of who he was and what his role was in this case. On February 9th, 1999, at exactly 1:20 p.m., Coppin State College's Chief of Security, Roland Collins, placed a call to the Baltimore City Police. One of the employees on campus, 42-year-old Alonzo Sellers, had returned from his lunch break with unsettling news. According to Alonzo Sellers, who worked as a groundskeeper at the college, he had made a trip home to fetch a tool that he needed. He lived only 5 miles away, and the trip only took about 15 minutes. When he got home, he found the tool he needed, downed a 22-ounce beer from his fridge, and headed back into work. But just a few miles away from work, nature called, and he pulled over to relieve himself. He reported he was driving west in the 2-lane Franklintown Road, so he pulled his truck over to the right and parked, then walked across the 2 lanes in a slight shoulder, beyond the concrete barriers next to the shoulder, and over 100 feet into the woods north of the road. If you want to see for yourself how far back into the woods Sellers went, you can find a video of the crime scene from 1999, when Adnan's attorney, Christina Gutierrez, trekked back there along with a small crew of people, including the city surveyor. Just search for undisclosed video of Lincoln Park burial site, and you'll see the route that Sellers allegedly took. All the way back in the woods, Sellers said, he stepped around a log and unzipped his pants, but then he stopped. When he looked down, he saw a small mound in the ground with a patch of black hair and white fabric that was poking through the shallow dirt. According to Sellers, he forgot he even had to urinate, zipped his pants back up, and left immediately. He then reported the finding to his superiors at the Coppin State campus, who alerted Baltimore authorities. Now, there have always been questions about Alonzo's story because so much of it never added up. Why didn't he wait to get to work a few miles away to use the bathroom? Where exactly did he pull over because there was no shoulder on the side of the road that he said he was on? Why did he then cross the other side of the street to relieve himself instead of just going next to his truck? Why didn't he, after crossing the street, just go behind the concrete barriers? Why did he then, in bitter, near-freezing weather, fight his way back to over 100 feet into the woods to take a leak?
Well, one reason we can be sure he went to such lengths to pee in private wasn't because he was shy. Sellers, by this time, already had a long and sordid history of public streaking and flashing women in public. That history, by the way, continued long after he found Hae Min Lee's body in 1999. If you're curious, just Google Maryland case search and then search his name on the website to see his criminal history. It also didn't help that Sellers failed the first polygraph he was given and only passed a polygraph after all the questions were changed. And while we know behavior evidence is often misused to infer guilt, it's hard to ignore how testy and confrontational he was on the stand when he testified. And you can see footage of that on the HBO documentary, The Case Against Adnan Syed.
Sellers, please step all the way up to the witness stand, please.
Let me direct your attention to February the 9th, sir. Well, sir, you recall the day that you found the body in Lincoln Park, don't you?
It's funny that I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, maybe we can give him a pass because he was testifying in a murder trial and realized how easily he could have been the prime suspect in the case. But then, fast forward to when Amy Berg, who was the director of that HBO series, went to visit Sellers to see if he would talk to her.
We tried to reach him numerous times. He didn't respond to us. So we went over to his house and we knocked on the door and he didn't come to the door. So then we went back to the car and we kind of hung out on the street for a little bit because we were surprised that he lived so close to Woodlawn High School, actually. It was like meters. And so we waited and then Alonzo came outside and he started mowing his lawn. And I went over to him to try to talk to him. And I introduced myself and he never turned the lawnmower off. He just kept like clenching his fists on the lawnmower handle. And he said, I'm not going to talk to you. I'm not going to talk to you. Get out of here. And I just kept pleading with him to please speak to me. And I just remember that he had this look in his eyes that kind of scared me. He seemed like he was restraining himself from like coming after me with this lawnmower, which he never turned off. And that was my whole impression of Alonzo Sellers and the meeting with him.
It's baffling, all of it, from his initial story of how he found the body to his behavior afterwards, until I presented the case to the super sleuths. I remember when Sarah first told me about Super Sleuths, and I thought this is really interesting. It's this multidisciplinary group. But I was like, gosh, so many people have looked at this case over the years. What could we possibly learn that's new? And really, my mind was blown at some of the feedback, and it has kind of fleshed out really, and answered a lot of outstanding questions. And one of those really was the questions was like, how do you make sense of Alonzo Sellers' story? And one of the things that was offered during that conversation was, I believe Gary is the one who began that conversation. He said, look, somebody with Sellers' profile, even if he had nothing to do with the killing of this girl, if he is left alone with the body of a young woman, it is unlikely that he's immediately going to report it. What's more likely is that he might have spent some time with it. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you think about that?
Oh, yeah, they spend a lot of time with it. That's why.
The possibility that Alonzo Sellers had found Hae's body and then spent time with it, maybe even a number of days, was shocking to consider. But it did tie into another story that had reached our attention, which we'll get to at the end of this episode. It could also explain why he was so nervous, agitated, and even angry when he was asked questions about finding the body. If he had touched Hae's body or clothing, his DNA and fingerprints could be on her anywhere, which could get him charged with her murder. And, just for a fresh recollection, when Hae was found, she was wearing a white fleece jacket, but her shirt and bra were pushed up, exposing her chest. And while she was dressed in pantyhose and underwear, her straight long skirt was hiked up above her waist. There were otherwise, however, no signs of a sexual assault. Does this scene track with the profile of someone with Sellers' behavior and history, and with the possibility that he had handled her body in some way before reporting it? According to both Dr. Burgess and other experts in the Super Sleuths group, yes, it does. Let's stop for a second, though, and talk about profiling, because that's certainly a sore subject for a lot of people, thanks to how it's been abused by law enforcement to unfairly target perfectly innocent civilians based upon their race, religion, ethnicity, or even just the way someone looks, dresses, or speaks.
Profiling was meant to be to take characteristics that had been studied and applying them to a current crime. So it was really based on legacy kinds of cases that had been analyzed. And that's where the organized and the disorganized, the one thing that we started with that the agents hadn't done was victimology. Because they were investigators, they never had done much in terms of interviewing victims or understanding victims. So when I took them back to that, the main question, instead of why did this happen, became who did this happen to? Why is she or he a victim?
Dr. Burgess also agreed with something former FBI agent Jim Clemente told us years ago, that Hae Min Lee likely knew her killer because no one takes the risk of moving a body unless they either know the victim or the scene of the crime can be tied to the perp, for example, inside the perp's house or workplace.
In terms of profiling characteristics, you look at the crime scene, which from what you've described has a lot of interesting features. In other words, it's outdoors, partially concealed. He could see hair and clothing.
Yeah.
It was known, he had to have known it was there. And I think the other thing in terms of what you described is we learned after talking to offenders that they would revisit the crime scene as a way to keep the physiology, if you want to call it that, the excitement, the more erotic aspect alive. I mean, that's what it was really all about.
What Dr. Burgess says about Hae Min Lee likely knowing her killer is the same thing that former FBI agent Jim Clemente told us years ago, that no one takes the risk of moving a body unless they either know the victim or the scene of the crime can be tied to the perp. For example, inside the perp's house or workplace. As far as we know, Alonzo Sellers had no known connection to Hae Min Lee, and it's hard to imagine how their paths would have crossed except for completely randomly. It doesn't mean we can completely rule out Sellers as a suspect, though, especially considering the authorities have never compared his DNA, his hair, or his fingerprints to those found on Hae's body, clothing, or car. But it does point to another possibility, and that is that Alonzo Sellers is telling the truth, that he merely found the body and had nothing to do with the murder, but not necessarily the whole truth about how he found the body and what he did afterwards. because one more question that has been baffling is in fact how he found the body. Again, go watch the video of the crime scene from 1999 on YouTube. And remember this, the city surveyor Philip Budemeyer was on the crime scene with first responders the day that Sellers led him to Hae's body. According to him, even though he was apparently standing right above the body, he didn't see it until they began removing the loose dirt from off of it. Even Dr. Burgess agrees. It's nearly impossible that he just stumbled across it.
I mean, it's like, why does this guy all of a sudden, just in the middle of February, get out of his car, cross the street, go over through Hill and Dale to urinate? Oh, come on. You know, he was out there looking for something.
Right. Or knew something was there.
He knew something was there.
Let's assume then, as a thought exercise, that Sellers knew the body was there. There are two ways for him to have known exactly where it was. Either he saw someone take the body back into the woods and followed the perp surreptitiously as they disposed of the body, or he himself put the body there. I'm not hesitant at all to say the first scenario is so unlikely it's nearly absurd. So let's continue the thought exercise, that it's more likely Sellers himself put the body there. Which takes us to another question that's bugged me since 1999. How could anyone, much less Sellers, have pulled off taking Hae's body that far back into the woods? Again, to set the scene, the part of Lincoln Park in which Hae was found was right off of two-lane Franklintown Road, a road that's both heavily traveled and well-policed. Yes, there was a narrow pullover next to some concrete barriers where a car could have pulled over to dispose the body. But the risk of leaving the car there on that little pullover while carrying a body through the frozen woods. Remember the night that Hae disappeared, a huge ice storm hit the area. Well, that risk seemed so high that I could never imagine anyone taking it, which was Sarah Kalin's take on it too.
Because the offender wants to distance themselves from the remains as quickly as possible. Every single second that body is in a car or you are with it, you are in danger of something unexpected happening and you being caught with it, or there being transfer of evidence. You know, like the faster you can distance yourself from the remains, the better.
Susan Simpson was also stumped by this and theorized that perhaps the perp didn't bring the body from Franklintown Road, but instead brought it from the opposite side of where it was found. But on the opposite side of the body was Dead Run Stream, and beyond that, a hill. So for somebody to bring the body that way would mean they had to struggle down the hill with it, then cross a stream with it to leave it by the log where Hae was eventually found. It's unlikely, but I guess not impossible. The point being, we just couldn't really figure out the logistics of how it all went down. That was until I visited the crime scene not long after my presentation to the Super Sleuths. I had been there a dozen times in the past, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, but this time I took my friend, colleague, and one of the best investigators I know, Sarah Kalin, with me. Sarah wasn't there more than 30 seconds before it all clicked for her.
I always say this, like when I start working on a case, like, you know, a lot of times I'll review the files, or in this case, you know, I knew what I knew from the public, and then you had presented it to our group. And so I had definitely had more information before the first time I went to the crime scene. But for me, when I get onto a scene is often when it's like all the pieces come together and like the picture on the cover of the puzzle box suddenly becomes crystal clear. And so when we got there, and you had always talked about that, this, you know, it is even in the middle of the night, it's a busy road. It is a cut through in the city of Baltimore. Like, yes, it's heavily wooded, but it's not like you're just going to have hours of unattended time to struggle with, you know, with human remains to, you know, bring them as far back as they were through all that brush and the trees and the vegetation and stuff. And the second we pulled up, and there's the little cutout, and all these years later, those like 2 or 3 cement barriers are still there that are kind of like on, but you know, you can pull into the cutout and then the barriers are there, and then the like dirt and the park part starts. So there's just a little bit of room between where you would park the car and have like enough room to get out on the passenger side or the driver's side and not get smacked in the roadway. And the second I saw that, I realized, oh, they just dropped the body here. Whoever actually placed Hae in Lincoln Park the first time, like when she was first killed and disposed of, they probably put her right behind the barrier and drove off.
I'm not going to lie. As soon as Sarah looked around and said, oh yeah, they just left her here behind the barriers, it was like a flash of light for me. It seemed so obvious, and yet in all these years, no one thought of it. But this wasn't Sarah's first rodeo, and it wasn't the first time she had seen such a thing. In fact, the first season of her chart-topping podcast, Why Can't We Talk About Amanda's Mom, investigates a case in which the female victim was also left by the side of the road. But if Hae Min Lee was indeed left right there behind the barriers, how did she end up deep in the woods then?
We do know that there is a variety of sexual offender or sometimes budding sexual offender who use photos of bodies, or in the case of an actual killer, the actual bodies, as repeat masturbatory material. And so what I was seeing there is the body got dropped off. Somebody came along and saw it, and rather than reporting it, was very excited, was sexually aroused, and they were the ones who took the time to move her further back so that they could revisit the body and cover her the way that she was covered, but not like when you see the photos, you can tell, you know, you can see the hair, you can see a little bit, but she's covered, but not buried. And that to me, it just screamed that somebody revisited her remains multiple times, probably as masturbatory material. And then as it became obvious that this was a big case, that this was, that the whole county was looking for this girl, that the whole state was aware of it, this was becoming a really big unsolved disappearance, that person understandably got spooked and either stopped going back, or if it was in fact Sellers, fabricated this reported story in order to be able to say that he found her without having to tell the actual circumstances.
Look, I know. This seems so far-fetched, and yet it would explain so much. It would explain why Hae's clothing was pushed up to reveal parts of her body. It would explain why she wasn't really truly buried, but was left kind of accessible. It would explain how Sellers knew exactly where the body was. It would even explain the lividity on Hae's body not matching the position she was found in. Now remember, she had full frontal, symmetrical lividity all down her body, and every medical examiner we spoke to said that meant she had to have been flat and face down for at least 10 hours before being moved to where she was eventually found. You know where the body could have been left flat, face down for 10 hours without being found? Behind those cement barriers. And none of this really was far-fetched for Sarah.
I mean, I think the I don't want to say failure of imagination, but that would be the term we would use of why I think maybe I was the first one to arrive at the scene and go, oh, there are two different people involved here. That's for me because I have done regular police work and regular investigations, and then studied the psychology involved in that, and also studied the psychology very specific to serial sexual predation. I can hold both of those thoughts in my head at the same time, and I think maybe a lot of detectives or investigators might know one or the other, but they might not have them. And I'm not saying I'm some brilliant person or whatever, but it's just that I've studied both of these things. And so I can see the disconnect between the disposal and the desire to revisit.
And if Sellers found the body and moved it himself, it would also explain a story that reached us years ago, connected to another infamous Baltimore true crime, and it was a story that left us completely confounded.
Baltimore has always been a quintessentially Catholic city.
The priests were the authority. Whatever they told you to do, you did.
The city has its level of corruption. Sister Kathy exemplified this spirit of compassion and kindness.
I have never had a teacher like that before. She was murdered our senior year, and it's always haunted many people in the community.
That was the trailer for the hit documentary series The Keepers, released in May 2017 on Netflix. In case you're not familiar with the series, it investigates the 1969 unsolved murder of nun Catherine Sesnick in Baltimore, Maryland. The investigation expands into something much broader, though: child abuse of mass proportions within the Baltimore Archdiocese and a cover-up of equal scale. On the night of November 7, 1969, 26-year-old Sister Kathy Sesnick left her apartment and purportedly drove to a shopping center to purchase a gift for her sister's engagement. Her roommate, Sister Helen Phillips, kept waiting for Sister Kathy to return, but she never did. Sister Helen reached out to two of their friends, both priests that lived nearby, one of whom was in a romantic relationship with Sister Kathy. Early the next morning, the friends found Sister Kathy's abandoned car parked illegally across from her apartment building and notified the police. The police then began an immediate search, but weeks went by with no sign of Sister Kathy. Then, 2 months later, on January 3, 1970, Sister Kathy's body was found by a hunter in a landfill about 6 miles from her home. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma, but no one was ever arrested for her murder. The series focuses on 3 women, 2 of whom are Sister Kathy's students at the Archdiocese-run Seton Keogh High School in Baltimore. Gemma Hoskins and Abby Schaub were both profoundly affected by their young, vibrant teacher's murder and spent decades demanding answers. The third woman, Jean Wenner, was also a student at the Keogh School. Wenner came forward in 1992 with allegations of abuse by Father Joseph Maskell, the school's chaplain and guidance counselor. Wenner also claimed that she had confided in Sister Kathy about the abuse. When Father Maskell found out, he took Wenner to a wooded area where he showed her Sister Kathy's body and threatened to kill her if she spoke to anyone ever again. In 1994, Wenner and another student filed a lawsuit against the Archdiocese, which sparked yet more survivors from the school to come forward.
What unfolds in the Keepers television series is a horrific web of abuse involving hundreds of victims, dozens of perpetrators, and evidence of a cover-up that included the Catholic Church, the Baltimore Police Department, and the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office. So what does this story have to do with the murder of Hae Min Lee? Well, sometime around the end of 2019, a podcaster who was involved in the investigation of Sister Kathy's murder reached out to me with a pretty shocking story.
Hi, Rabia. This is Shane Waters. I have been a crime podcaster since 2008. I also host a history podcast called Hometown History. But for foul play, several years ago, I came across Sister Kathy's case, which took place in 1969 in Baltimore. And that's when I linked up and discovered the story of what might have happened to her. The rest is kind of history, of course, because, as you know, that Netflix released a docuseries called The Keepers.
In 2019, I met Shane Waters at a podcasting conference. Shane had long been investigating Sister Kathy's murder case.
I've been working on a series of Sister Kathy's episodes ever since I started working on her case. There are now more than 93 episodes, and each episode is basically an update on the continued work that I and all of the people who are involved in Kathy's case have continued to do since The Keepers aired.
Shane has worked with dozens of people on the case, including one particular former student of Sister Kathy's. Now, this student asked that her name be kept from the public due to a lot of health and personal struggles she's going through, and so we're happy to respect that. I'll just refer to her as Miss X going forward. Now, in the course of their work and meetings, the similarities between Hae's case and Sister Kathy's case would come up.
I think what will surprise a lot of people is to hear that although 30 years apart, and by 30 years I mean almost exactly 30 years, both crimes take place in a very similar area of Baltimore. In fact, where Sister Kathy lived is just less than a 10-minute drive to where Hae was found. And so because of that, of all the times that I've been to Baltimore to work with all of the folks involved and to continue to uncover more information, there have been pieces of time where the two cases sort of overlap, not because of there being the same suspects or anything like that. It's more of detectives and officers and things like that who have been involved in both cases over time.
Miss X revealed a conversation she had with one of her sources to Shane, and it was a conversation that Shane felt very strongly I needed to know.
The very first time that I realized there could be more information from someone that might be able to help with Hae's case would have been several years ago, probably 2018, maybe around somewhere like that. After COVID, time flies, and I just remember it was before COVID. But I was having a conversation with one of the people who I work with, but at least one of them shared a conversation that they had with the informant that you would meet on The Keepers named Deep Throat.
If you've seen The Keepers, you may remember an off-camera anonymous source identified as Deep Throat. We're introduced to Deep Throat in episode 4 of the series and told that he is a retired Baltimore City detective that worked on the abuse allegations brought by Gene Werner in 1994. When Deep Throat learned decades later that former students were investigating the murder of their teacher, Sister Kathy, he reached out to them with information. And you can see what he had to say about the investigation into the Baltimore Archdiocese sex child abuse allegations on the TV series. But what we want to share with you is what he told Miss X about Adnan's case. Now, The Keepers came out not long after Serial, so one night, Miss X and Deep Throat were having a conversation about Hae Min Lee's murder and whether or not he thought Adnan was guilty. Oh, yes, definitely, said Detective Deep Throat, and his opinion wasn't based on a gut feeling. He said he had personal knowledge that Adnan was involved in the murder. According to Shane, here is what Deep Throat told Miss X.
Deep Throat had shared that he had some type of relationship of some kind. It's not quite clear what that meant, but he was talking about Alonzo Sellers. And what Deep Throat had shared was that he had been working in a station at that time, and Alonzo Sellers came in and asked specifically for him, and then he told him that he knows where the girl is. So Sellers and Deep Throat drove out to the park. Sellers was telling him where to go and where to turn and where to stop. When they get out to where Hae's body was, Sellers pointed to the ground, and at first, Deep Throat said that he thought it was just some leaves on the ground that he was pointing to. He was very confused about what he was looking at. But when he got down and got closer, he noticed that there was a patch of skin that was sort of sticking out of the ground. At that point, Deep Throat asked Sellers, how did he know this girl? And Sellers said that he had seen Hae's boyfriend and his buddy, as he said, bury her. But then he had admitted that he saw her boyfriend and his buddy bury her, and then he went and dug her up and played with her. At that point, Deep Throat cuffed Sellers. He said it was right there on the spot, and then he took him back to the station. Around the middle of the interview between him and Sellers, another officer came in and said, "You can let him go. The boyfriend just confessed."
It's hard to decide what's the most shocking thing about this story, but let's start with a couple of things that obviously couldn't have happened. First, in no world does it make sense that Sellers could see, much less identify, the men who moved his body into the woods as the victim's boyfriend and friend. If Sellers had in fact seen the two men leave his body in the woods, how would he know who they were? If by boyfriend Sellers was referring to Adnan, well, Adnan wasn't arrested until almost 2 months after Hae had disappeared. Sellers would have had no idea who Adnan even was back on January 13th, 1999, the day that Hae disappeared, much less what his relationship with the victim was. Now, as far as we know, Sellers gave Deep Throat no description of the men or how he happened to come across them moving this body into the woods. Were they pulled over on the side of the road? Did he pull over too? When did it all happen? Sellers reported finding the body on February 9th, 1999. Did he see these men move Hae's body on January 13th, but not say anything for a full month? Did he see it happen shortly before he reported the body? Who knows? The details are sparse and don't make sense for other reasons. After all, if Sellers had indeed seen anyone leave the body in the woods, why didn't he testify to that? And if that person had been Adnan, well, that was a slam dunk for the prosecution that would have corroborated Jay's testimony. Then there's the part of the story where the other detectives tell Deep Throat to let Sellers go because the boyfriend had confessed. If the boyfriend referred to here as Adnan, or even if he was his current boyfriend, Don Clindes, well, neither of them has ever confessed. And even more glaringly obvious is the fact they didn't even have a body or a murder investigation on their radar until that point. Until Sellers reported finding Hae, they had a missing persons case. So how did they get a confession before they even knew a crime took place? This all left us with so many more questions, but first we had to verify that Ms. X did in fact tell Shane what he says she did. And then we had to find out if Deep Throat said all those things. Ms. X actually spoke to numerous people about the story, including Sarah Koenig, apparently, though Koenig didn't report on any of it in serial or during her follow-ups. Each time she was interviewed, Ms. X verified that yes, Deep Throat had told her this story, and she believed him. In fact, she believed him so genuinely that she also believed Adnan was guilty because Deep Throat told her so. Amy Berg sent her investigator Tyler Maroney to speak to Ms. X, and again, she confirmed to him what she had told our initial source, Shane Waters. In an attempt to dig further, Tyler then interviewed George Anderson, the campus police official that Alonzo Sellers had reported finding the body to.
We interviewed George Anderson, who is his boss at Coppin State, and the interview left us with more questions than answers. George said that when he came back to work that day to report that he had just discovered Hae Min Lee's body, which he didn't know was Hae Min Lee's body at the time, but he discovered a body, that he was very calm and he did not seem like a person that just had experienced, the discovery of a body. He did not look like he had just discovered a body in Lincoln Park. He was very calm, he was very cool, and he was very collected. So George had him get in the car with him, and they went and talked to the police at that moment, and he just couldn't believe his demeanor.
That wasn't the only thing George Anderson told Tyler. He also told him that back around the time all this went down, Alonzo Sellers was particularly fond of Asian girls and liked to take sex workers to Lincoln Park. Whereas in his interview with Baltimore police, Sellers told them that he had never been to Lincoln Park before. Anyhow, back to Miss X. In all these years, while others had contacted her, I never did. I've made it a practice not to contact potential witnesses, not since I got that affidavit from Agent McLean back in 2000. And in Miss X's case, I heard she was rather irritated when contacted about the case. But not long ago, I reached out to her to see if maybe she changed her mind after all these years. I was hoping she would let me interview her for this episode, but well, she was still pretty agitated and unhappy to hear from me. She did not, however, deny the story. She sent me a text confirming the details of what she remembered and again confirmed these details to Shane just a couple of weeks ago. And every single time, her account of what Deep Throat told her remains consistent with no added or detracted details. So let's dig into some of the details here and examine what seem to be some glaring questions. First of all, we know for sure Sellers did report finding a body to campus police on February 9th, 1999. We know for sure campus police contacted Baltimore police the same day, and first responders and investigators were led to the body by Sellers, again, on that same day. So one obvious question is, when would Deep Throat have made that arrest of Sellers that he said he did? On what day did all of that happen?
Again, remember, Alonzo Sellers reported the body on February 9th, 1999. Adnan wasn't arrested until February 28th, 1999. Putting aside the fact that Adnan has never ever confessed to this crime, there are weeks between the discovery of the body and Adnan's arrest. In other words, no part of this story in which another officer tells Deep Throat To let Sellers go because the boyfriend confessed adds up. There was no boyfriend or ex-boyfriend, to be technically correct, in the picture on February 9th, at least not officially. But there was this. 5 days before Hae's body was discovered, police investigative records show they had already begun focusing on Adnan. They had pulled his driving record, pulled him over for a seatbelt violation, and requested his cell phone records. Investigators did not apparently know yet that Hae Min Lee had been murdered. At the time, the initial focus on Adnan was in the course of a missing persons investigation. If in fact Deep Throat's story is true, the only way in which it could make sense was if Sellers went directly to Deep Throat on February 9th, but because the police were already circling Adnan, they wanted to get Sellers off the hook. In any other world, Sellers would have been the prime suspect.
Given his criminal history, he would have immediately been a suspect for the murder. And, whoever he confided in that or in his own mind knew that, and that was why he had to come up with this story about going all the way back into the woods to pee and then finding her.
But if the police already had their focus on Adnan, they needed Sellers to change his story about how he found the body. Maybe the police even recognized there was no way Sellers saw two men move the body into the woods, much less be able to identify the actual identity of the strangers as the victim's boyfriend and the boyfriend's friends. And so, Alonzo Sellers had to change his story and re-report finding the body in an entirely different way to an entirely different set of people. Which is why none of the official reports even mentioned Deep Throat. He was categorically not one of the official Baltimore City police investigators involved in the case. We know that because we know exactly who Deep Throat is and have sent investigators to speak with him, but he won't speak.
The entire story is wild, and if any part of this story is true, what we are talking about is a vast cover-up by at least Deep Throat, if not more members of the Baltimore police, and a complete rewriting of the official narrative. And the cover-up would extend to eliminating Sellers as a suspect. They didn't take any fingerprints, hair, or DNA samples from Sellers, all of which is highly suspicious given his existing criminal history. But it does make sense if they knew he had fondled the body and couldn't afford to find anything of his on it when they already had Adnan in their sights. The only way to eliminate him was to give him a polygraph. And remember, the problem was that he failed the first polygraph. So no worries, they gave him another chance. The questions were all reworked, and this time he passed and walked away clean as a whistle from the investigation. We go into the polygraphs in our Season 1 coverage of this case, if you want to go back and take a listen, and it's covered in depth in my book, Adnan Story. There may have been another reason they desperately wanted to eliminate Sellers as a suspect, and that ties back directly to why he might have gone to Deep Throat to begin with. We know exactly who Deep Throat is. He's not just a retired Baltimore City police detective. He was an investigator with the Baltimore Police Child Abuse Unit. That was why he was assigned to investigate Gene Wenner's allegations of sexual abuse at Seton Keogh High School. His entire beat was child sexual abuse, with a specific focus on the local Catholic parish. In fact, Deep Throat was an investigator on a 2005 case in which an ordained priest who had survived being shot by one of his victims was facing sexual abuse charges. When the judge didn't let one of the priest's victims testify, Deep Throat blurted out in open court, "There are other victims."
So is it possible that Sellers' connection to Deep Throat, the reason he went directly to Deep Throat to tell him about Hae's body, was that he too was once a victim of sexual abuse, and the two men knew each other because of these investigations? Sure, it's possible, especially given the likelihood that a man with sexual proclivities like Sellers had severe childhood trauma. And then there's this, a point that has been brought up repeatedly on our show, on the HBO documentary, and in Rabia's book. Sellers has never spent a day in prison for his lengthy criminal record. And that record now includes a chilling assault he committed a few years ago, but one that we won't cover here. That's because the 5th episode, finale of HBO's The Case Against Adnan Syed, comes out this fall and reports on that assault, what the police found in Sellers' basement, Sellers' connection to Seton Keogh High School, and a connection between Sellers and Hae Min Lee's car, and we don't want to give any spoilers. Watch that episode when it comes out. We promise it's going to be worth the wait. Back to the issue of Sellers not spending a day in his life in prison for all of his many crimes. We have long suspected that he worked as an informant. He may have even been an informant in Deep Throat's Catholic Church investigations. It would explain why he went to Deep Throat to tell him about Hae's body and why the police barely investigated him for Hae's murder.
So what does this all mean? In some ways, it confirms what we already knew about the official narrative, that it's a total crock. The lividity evidence alone proves that. What else to expect from a police department whose corruption goes so deep that it covers up decades of sexual abuse by the most powerful institutions in the city? From the murder of Sister Kathy, to the murder of Hae Min Lee, to the death of Freddie Gray and the prosecution of Keith Davis Jr. and countless other cases, it's been shown repeatedly that we cannot trust what Baltimore City authorities tell us. I fully trust that Deep Throat told Miss X this story. She has been consistent for many years now about the details, confirmed it for numerous people, and never recanted it. But was Deep Throat lying to her or telling the truth? Or is the story a combination of some truths and some fictions? It could be that decades after all this took place, Deep Throat has confused some of the details. But it's hard to believe that the entire thing is a lie because there's simply no reason for Deep Throat to make it up. And also because it does explain a number of things we couldn't understand until now. As to the extent of Sellers' involvement in this case, we may never know. And your guess is as good as ours. Remember, none of the forensic evidence from Hae's case, including the hair and fibers found on her body, dozens of fingerprints in her car, and the DNA from her fingernail and shoes, has ever been sourced. It's absolutely nuts to me that to date, no DNA or hair samples have been taken from the man who found Hae's body, Alonzo Sellers, to the man Hae Min Lee was dating and apparently going to see on the day that she disappeared, Don Kleindienst. The state has all that forensic evidence and is doing absolutely nothing to match it to anyone. But that doesn't mean that no one is doing anything. After taking Sarah Kalin to the crime scene, I hired her to get me samples of the prime suspects on my list. And Sarah delivered, having made numerous middle-of-the-night trash dives, God bless her. The trash dives got us DNA samples that need to be compared to the DNA found on Hae's belongings. But that's up to the state. In fact, that's up to State's Attorney Ivan Bates, because just a few months ago, I handed over all the DNA profiles we had compiled, along with a full investigative report, to his office. If there is anyone with the power to actually figure out what happened in the case, to call for an investigation into Deep Throat's involvement, to determine if there was a massive cover-up here, to match the forensic evidence to a source, and to eliminate the suspects that State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby pointed to in her motion to vacate Adnan's conviction, well, that's the current State's Attorney. Will he? Won't he? We will examine all the behind-the-scenes politics, grudges, drama, posturing, and manipulation between Marilyn Mosby and Ivan Bates later in the season. But for now, there's more for us to tell you all about the characters actually involved in the case, more stories you haven't heard, and more loose ends to tie up before we get to the two states' attorneys. Next time on Undisclosed.
I am so glad that you guys came back on air with updates. I was around in 2014 and watched this or listened to all of Serial, all of Undisclosed, was super just invested in this case for Adnan. Went to Baltimore to Lincoln Park and looked around just trying to see where things went down. Literally was shattered for somebody like Adnan. I was 24 at the time. He's close to my age, I guess. I'm in my 30s now. So, it just kind of really, I guess that case really hit home because I was a 90s, 2000s kid in middle school, high school, and thinking how unjust and how, if that happened today, I hope that someone would advocate and just not allow that. And I guess with DNA and all the things we have out now, it would be much harder. And I'm sure people tried then that knew, what was going on, but without DNA and all the proper things, it just blew my mind that he was in jail for what they had no supporting evidence to have this innocent young man in jail. And for Hae Lee too, that her parents would know who actually was responsible, which seems like it's been a never-ending thing for them too. So it's just crazy. So glad you guys are back. So glad Adnan is living out and is not incarcerated anymore. That's what should have been all along. So if it hadn't been for you guys, he probably would be. So that's incredible. Thanks for sharing all the things that you guys have done.
Hey guys, it's Mithil, executive producer of Undisclosed Toward Justice. Want to give a quick shout out to Hannah McCarthy for audio production and Animal Weapon for our theme music. This time around, we're doing something different. You can leave us questions, comments, thoughts, and suggestions in a voice note, and we might even play it on air. Just go to speakpipe.com/undisclosed and start recording. For those of you that want to engage on social media, you can follow, share, and like us on all the different platforms. We're on Instagram and Facebook at Undisclosed Podcast. For folks on X, we're still at Undisclosed Pod. Also, please go to subscribe to our new YouTube channel at Undisclosed Pod so you don't miss out on any content there. Whether you're a new or returning listener, you can check out our previous cases and bonus episodes by going to our revamped website at undisclosedpod.com. If you want to follow Colin and Rabia on social media as well, you can find Rabia at Rabia2 on Instagram, and Colin is at EvidenceProf on Instagram and Blue Sky. Thanks for your continued support for us and for our sponsors. Until next time.